Brilliant. Fantastic. Excellent. Let me know and we'll do what we can. So. Well, ladies and gentlemen, if I could bring this huge audience here in the Conservative Home marquee to order, a really warm welcome to those of you who are here in the Conhome marquee in Birmingham, a warm welcome to all of those of you watching at home around the UK and around the world on the Conservative Home YouTube channel to this event, which has really become an annual installation. Something I know an awful lot of people look forward to. I get a lot of correspondence before party conference with people's suggested questions and topics they'd like us to raise in this, the business conversation, hosted by Conservative Home in partnership with the FSB. We've run this, I've lost count of how many years we've run this together with the FSB for, but it's always been a fantastic thing to do. We're joined, I'm Mark Wallace, the Chief Executive of Conservative Home, as I'm sure various of you will have seen me arguing with people on the internet, which appears to have somehow become my job. Better than arguing with people outside on the street, I should say, because on the internet...
That's my job.
Exactly. On the internet, you're both at the same volume and none of you have a trumpet, which is a big improvement. We're very, very fortunate to be joined this evening, of course, by Jacob Rees-Mogg, the star of the Mogcast, the Business Secretary of the new government, known to all of you, I'm sure, and also by Tina McKenzie, who is here in her capacity as the UK Policy and Advocacy Chair of the FSB, but of course is a very successful businesswoman in her own right as well. Now, the theme of this discussion, unsurprisingly, does what it says on the tin, is for us to get the opportunity to start to explore some of the issues in the economy at large with relation to business, the new government, this growth-focused, growth-driven government, and its attitude of what that means in policy and practical terms, something hotly debated, not just at this conference, but around the nation right now for various reasons that we're all acutely aware of. And also, of course, to give you, Conservative Home's readers, the chance to put your question to both of our guests. So first, I hope you'll join me in giving them a very warm welcome. And if I could kick off for a question for both of our guests. We've heard from the Prime Minister about her vision of Britain as an enterprise nation, the idea that this is one of the central ideas and central focuses of the government, something it wishes to help to put into reality by its own actions, but more importantly helps to allow others to put into action through their own enterprise and through the development of existing businesses, the foundation of new ones, and the attraction of investment from overseas. Could I ask each of you, what does that look like in policy terms for you? Let's begin with Tina.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. Hello, everyone. There's no surprise that for the UK small business community, COVID has been such a tough time. And coming out of COVID, we lost 400,000 small businesses across the country in 2020. Coming into 2021, I think most businesses were hoping for some sort of recovery, starting to invest again. And then we obviously had the geopolitics, what we've seen in terms of the war in Ukraine, the crisis in energy. And it seems for small businesses and business in general that the challenges are just non-stop. Now, obviously what we need in terms of government supporting business across the country is agility, speed, flexibility, and just general support, knowing that you've got the government on your side and that they're not going to make life difficult. They can't solve all the problems, but you know, they can step in and support where possible. So for small business across this country and medium-sized businesses and even some big businesses, it's been a particularly tough time. Those that are the smallest with the smallest margins struggle most because they don't have the reserves. They don't have the flexibility to go into new markets. You know, they're your small businesses that you all know up and down your village, high street, up and down the towns and cities, the rural communities. And so we're in a really, really difficult time. I think the announcements that we heard, we were asking the government for months to do something on this national insurance question. which I know, Jacob, you supported. We were delighted to see the reversal of that. Why would we tax small businesses more in what was a really, really tough time? I think also holding the employment allowance at the £5,000, a lot of people don't even know about that, but the government held that at the higher rate of £5,000 for the smallest businesses. You know, that was really welcomed by our members. And then finally, the help on energy. Well, there was an existential crisis in small businesses in this country. If we hadn't have done something on energy, it would have been a real problem. Yes, we would have liked it sooner, but the fact that we got it within 48 hours of the new Prime Minister coming in was a real relief to us. So that's where we stand on what's happened in the last few weeks.
And for that to go beyond, you know, in terms of what's next on the enterprise nation, what are your next kind of...
I have a long list for Jacob. We've only just met. I'm really looking forward to working with you, Jacob, especially a West Belfast girl. I know we're just going to get on brilliantly, because I know you like to get things done, and so do I. I think for entrepreneurship generally across the country, we've got to encourage more people and make it easier to open businesses. We've got to encourage more flexibility around lending. I mean, we send our kids off to university and we write a cheque for 40, 50 grand of student loans. And if you're not academic and you're an entrepreneur and you want to go and open a business, you'll struggle to get 2.5 grand from the credit union. You know, there's a real question around, you know, encouraging entrepreneurship, enterprise, and the people. I mean, there's probably plenty of entrepreneurs here in the audience, and most of the entrepreneurs I work with and know aren't particularly interested in the academic route. They want to go and solve problems. They want to go and start companies, whether it be online, in their back bedroom, in the garage. They're entrepreneurial at their heart, and that's what they want to do. So we've got to make that starting up a business easier. As I said, we lost 400,000 in 2020. We haven't yet got the number for 2021. So we've got to make the birth rate higher and the death rate lower of small businesses in this country. And remember, every business was once a small business, you know, and that's why they're so important, because they are the little garden, the little pot plant, which will grow to the big trees that you probably have in your lovely garden, I'm sure. You know, that is the evolution of business. I have a few myself too. So, you know, so we want to make it easier, and I know Jacob talks a lot about regulation. We want less regulation. We want less of the admin tasks that we see, that sometimes in Whitehall, I think sometimes the policy people just don't understand how hard it is for business to jump through all of the loops. I think we did put a question into one of the departments and we asked, just tell us, as the FSB, just give us a list of all your regulations. Well, the answer that came back, and you're going to love this, the answer that came back was it would be too much work to tell you, and they probably couldn't pull it all together. It's so much, they probably couldn't pull it all together anyway. So it tells us the type of environment we're in. So there's lots to go for if you're that way inclined. The list goes on, but I probably stop there for the minute.
Only for the minute.
Let Jacob get a word in.
Jacob, you're charged in large part by creating this enterprise nation from a slogan into a reality. What does it look like?
Well, first of all, I think a lot of what Tina said is absolutely spot on. I think the job of the government is to set up the framework in which businesses can get on with business. Government can't direct business, it can't make business work, but it can produce the platform, and that is things like the national insurance rate, that national insurance is straightforwardly a tax on jobs, and therefore the lower it is, the better it is. And that when people set up a business and they're employing the next person, yes, the £5,000 helps, but there's always the next person you want to employ, and you're thinking this is going to be a real cost on top of what I pay the person, and therefore I might delay it. And anything that does that hinders the growth of the economy. So if we are to get to a growing economy, we need to have a tax and regulatory system that works, which is what the Friday before last was working towards. But, and again, I'm grateful for Tina's comments on the energy package. The government has to step in when something is overwhelming. It is not the job of government to step in day to day and to tell business what to do or to pick winners or any of those sorts of things. But when there is an existential crisis, the government has to act. And the people involved, and people like me, were working on this during the summer. I had some meetings where people must have looked at me rather oddly, because I was there nominally as Brexit Opportunities Minister, trying to work out how we dealt with the energy crisis And what the Brexit Opportunities Minister was doing with the energy crisis wasn't entirely clear, except for rumours as to what the now Prime Minister was planning to do should she win the Tory leadership campaign. But that meant that we were pretty ready to get things in place from as soon as the new government was appointed, and to announce them within 48 hours, and then to bring out the details for business. But regulation is essential because it is a cost to business at any stage in its formation, but that when you're big, it is proportionately a lower cost. If you have one compliance officer in your business and you're only employing 10 people, that is 10% of your business. If it's 1 per 100, it's 1%. It's really straightforward. And the number of compliance officers does not grow pro rata with the growth in your business. I speak as somebody who's been in financial services for some years, or was before I got into government, and it therefore becomes a club for incumbents. Regulation backs incumbents. It backs big business against challengers. But it's small businesses that create the employment. New employment comes, generally speaking, from smaller businesses. And there are figures from the US going back to the war where net employment creation comes from the small businesses, usually with net declines in employment in big business. So if you're to have a successful growing economy, small businesses who you want to help, and you mustn't therefore regulate them as if they are big businesses. Because if you do, you stop the level of growth, you won't have the economic growth you need. And so I'm glad to say today the Prime Minister has announced that the definition of small businesses for new regulations will go up from 250 to 500 employees. So that's important. You also don't want to have threshold obstacles. So you don't want people not to take on the 250th employee because then they move to a higher regulated status. You want to try and ensure that that doesn't become a problem. Now, there must be some limit. There always is, but the higher the limit, the better.
Tina, is that something you support? I mean, from your point of view, the envelope of what is a small business, as the Federation of Small Businesses, expanding quite dramatically. Is there a risk that the small, I mean, I run Conservative Home, which is a small business, well below the 250 range yet. But yeah, is there a risk that those smaller businesses get drowned out by doing that?
No, I don't think that's the problem. I think the issue is that, 99% of enterprises in this country are under 250 staff. We know that. So 99% of all businesses in this country are under 250. When you go up to 500, it includes, you probably have the number, do you? Is it 400,000 or?
It's that order of magnitude.
Yeah, it's, so the question for me really would be that these are new businesses being included in the SME definition, which is a good thing actually. However, I think new regulation then, we're still, the 5.5 million, the 99% will still be bound by all the regulation that we have. And I know you're looking at that, and so what I'd like to see is, that's interesting that it's gone to 500, and that's good for those businesses that are making that transition. A bit in the same sense as the people who, the VAT threshold of 85,000. It's the same principle when they say, is it really worth hiring another person to go to 100,000? Then you're back down below, and so maybe we can get the Chancellor to look at that as well, because it's a similar principle. So I think it's a good thing, but I think what we've got to really do is dig deep into the amount of regulation that's there for the SME community, be it 250 or below or 500 or below, because we could really make a big difference in terms of the time and resources, challenges and stress that they have. And it's not just on one regulation, taking a bird's eye view. At the Federation of Small Business, we look to British Columbia, and you've probably heard of that, the British Columbia model, not the state obviously. And they took away over a third of the regulation just by looking at a bird's eye view of why we have certain forms to fill in, certain extra information to give. It wasn't just all about just changing one regulation. And I think that's something that could really impact and help the small businesses of the country. So, size, bringing it up to 500, great, but let's really dig deep and see how we can help them with the regulation that's there.
I completely agree with that it's not just about raising the number, it's also about looking at regulations and ensuring that they serve some useful purpose. Because what happens is a regulation comes in to deal with a problem decades ago, and it just stays there. And it may have no relevance to what is currently going on. And this isn't about a mad rush to remove all safety regulations and things like that. It's about ensuring that the regulations are ones you actually need and that represent real issues that businesses face. And reviewing them. I mean, this is part of the retained EU law process, which means retained EU law regulations will be reviewed. That doesn't mean they're all going to be scrapped, but they will at least be looked at to see if they achieve any definite objective.
We are, of course, I can hear some people in the room thinking the same thing. We're 12 years into a Conservative government. I've taken part in, written about, reported on a variety of kind of reviews of regulation to deal with the red tape that's lingered. Firstly, is the quantum of what's still there really that sizable? And secondly, if so, why? What have the previous Conservative governments failed to get a handle on in terms of clearing that stuff out by now?
Oh, EU regulation, overwhelmingly. That until we were absolutely, completely and utterly out of the European Union, we could not get rid of EU law. So we had the 1 in, 2 out rule exclusive of EU regulation. Well, that was completely pointless because an EU regulation would come in that was costing tens of millions of pounds and we would get rid of the sovereign's right to own sturgeon caught in the rivers in the United Kingdom, which was one of the regulations we got rid of on the 1 in, 2 out rule. But we weren't doing anything about the EU because we couldn't. It wasn't legal for us to do anything about it. The retained EU law bill, we've got 2,500 EU regulations that we can look at, and I hope we can chop some of them up.
Is that fair? And the FSB had a voice in the red tape challenge and a variety of editions of this. Is it the case that aside from retained EU regulation, we're in a healthier position and that stable's been cleaned?
Well, I think we need all night on that one, to be honest, to go back into, you know, the whys and wheres of EU regulation and what held us up and what didn't. But what I will say is this. I'm a wee bit concerned, and Jacob can probably help me with this one. I've heard that we're revoking the business impact target by bringing in on the 22nd of September, the retained EU law bill. And I'm worried about that because that means we'll cease to have a focus on considering regulatory impacts. And that's really important for small businesses, and I'm hoping that you probably have a solution to that.
The business impact target didn't do any good. That's why we're getting rid of it. And having read quite a lot of them as legislation came forward, they were going through the motions rather than doing anything to reduce regulation. What we have to do is to have reducing regulation as a thrust of government policy and to do it through the policy-making process, which is exactly what we plan to do. The business impact target always seemed to come up with the suggestion that the impact was marginal if that's what the government wanted to do, which isn't really the purpose. And that you've got to look at the financial cost of the total regulation, not merely the administrative burden of filling out the form. And all they looked at really was the burden of filling out the form. But that's not the point. If it makes the business less competitive, if it makes the whole cost of doing business more expensive, that's the burden. And so we've got to make sure we're looking at that, the total, rather than just the administration.
I think there's some brilliant examples through COVID, actually, where government had to act. So, for example, all of a sudden we're allowed to have al fresco dining outside a cafe or outside a little restaurant. Because we had to be outside in the fresh air, it wasn't illegal to put table and chairs out. You know, some of those things, I think. I know running a recruitment company, we were able to register people and do the right to work online. Now, as of last week, people have to come in again face to face and do all of these checks. And so I think there's some good examples through COVID where we've loosened things up and it was easier for businesses that potentially we can hold on to again.
Well, I agree with that too, that things like why can't a pub do a takeaway meal, which is against planning rules in most cases. But what problem is that? The pub in West Hertfordshire, the Crown, regularly, I think on a daily basis, took lunch over to an elderly lady who was housebound, which probably was technically against the planning laws. And you suddenly realise we've got planning laws that stop people doing sensible and nice to do things for no very obvious purpose or inconvenience to anybody else. And I agree, I think we should learn from rules that we got rid of during COVID to see if they really need to come back.
Does that mean that back to normal is the wrong goal to have when thinking about getting the post-COVID world? Actually, back to if normal had all sorts of flaws, how do you get into the policy-making process of actually realising that there are things that are serendipitous changes that we should keep?
Well, I'd take another example. The MHRA did an absolute brilliant job as a regulator in getting the vaccine through. It was a really superb effort. It worked with companies. It worked simultaneously with the companies as they were doing their development. And instead of being a regulator that said, no, this is dangerous, it said, let's make this work. Let's test it properly. That seems to me to be the model for other regulators. Rather than being the abominable no men, they should be people who are in favour of business and competition and market activity.
On that note, Jacob, there were various suggestions floated, I think, during the leadership campaign around the combination of that about a sizable kind of unification of a variety of different regulators, including on the financial services front. Where are things on that?
Well, there's a financial services bill that is in Parliament at the moment. Policy is as the policy is at the moment. I can't announce changes today, and they may not be my responsibility to announce, but I'm sure that things that were promised in the election campaign will be delivered upon.
Tina, you said earlier about the welcome news of that action on energy for businesses rapidly after the formation of the government. How were you and your members feeling when you were hearing the now Prime Minister say, we don't believe in handouts? Actually, that's not the solution. We think giving that kind of direct action wasn't on the table.
I think what you'll find with most small business people who are really ingrained in the communities around the country is that they don't mind looking after other people. You know, they have a social conscience. They may be in business, but this whole ideology, this culture that you've got business over here and looking after people over there, that's not right, because they're members of the community. They have, people in their family that need the NHS, people in their family that need elderly care. They're just like everyone else. And I think, they don't earn a lot of money. Someone asked me about this 45 pence tax rate, and I said most of our members don't earn 150,000, believe it or not, So I think that, they're mostly, all of the people I've met in small businesses are socially responsible. They're the people that went out and helped the elderly. As Jacob says, the guy in the pub who went over to the elderly person, they're looking after their communities. They are the people who are sponsoring the local kids' football teams. They are the ones that a lot of people turn to when they need things in their local villages, if you need to have a lend of the van or move something or help somebody. So they instinctively want to build a good country that has good services. And the way they can play their part in that is by paying their taxes, which invariably small businesses pay their taxes in this country. They're not, they're not the people that are going offshore with this, that, and the other model. They are the good people of this country that are giving back every day. And I think that if they're earning a lot of profit, they don't mind paying tax. What they care about is that before they even open their door and sell one product, one piece of paper, one pen, they have a tax called rates. And these business rates, we've talked about it for years. The government agree that it's not an ideal tax. And, to put the small business rates relief up, which is what we were hoping for, maybe it's still going to come, you never know. But we were hoping that the small business threshold would go up to around 25,000. That would have cost about £1 billion. I know the 45p cost us around 2 billion. We were sitting fingers crossed, really hoping that if we could take that burden off the smallest of businesses with that business rates, they can stay open, they can keep employing, they can grow bigger, more people can move into high streets. You're going to get nicer high streets, you're going to get less empty buildings, and so we're really pushing the government to look at this regressive business rates tax, because, we don't mind paying tax, but we want to pay tax when we make a profit, not before we've even opened the door.
Secretary of State, you'll be hearing an awful lot of people right now talking about this, the change to the 45p tax rate, suggesting that it would be more productive, more equitable to allocate the energy or the cash for that action to something else. Business rates, the universal credit taper, cutting other taxes further down the system, supporting uprating of welfare. How do you answer them?
Well, cutting the tax rate from 50p to 45p didn't actually cost the taxpayer any money at all. Saw more income come in. So let's be careful about these forecasts. They are not holy writ. They are guesses at what may happen, and it wouldn't surprise me in the least if 40p raised more money for HMRC than 45p does. But it also makes us globally competitive. The US is getting away with 37p in the pound. We're still at a premium to the United States. Is that really where we want to be? Don't we want to be competitive with other countries? Why do we think that having high tax rates is a good thing? We don't. We think that low tax rates are a good thing. We want people to keep the money that they earn, and that encourages them to earn in the United Kingdom. But there are very valid criticisms of rates. There are very valid criticisms of most form of taxation for obvious reasons. It's why a Conservative government always wants to keep all taxes as low as possible. The fundamental principle is that it is your money, ladies and gentlemen. It is not the government's money. There is no such thing as government money. It is taxpayers' money, and we should be very careful about money that we take from taxpayers, and we should ensure that our tax system maximises economic growth. And let's be blunt about it, small businesses are in fact unremunerated tax collectors, aren't they? Because they pay the PAYE for their employees, they pay the VAT and have to fill out the VAT forms. I mean, if you were to go back to ancient Rome and make small businesses tax collectors, they'd make a very good margin on it, which unfortunately, or fortunately for the point of view of HMRC, they don't.
On this question of the way the energy policy develops, you mentioned it, there's a huge intervention, obviously with the part of the package on consumers, really big intervention with regard to business energy bills. The Prime Minister was saying that we don't believe in handouts, that isn't the route for the solution. We're now in the position that you elucidated a few minutes ago of, well, there comes a circumstance at which point it is right for government to intervene. How and when did that change of perspective to happen? Were you saying in her ear, actually, that's not going to work on this problem?
What is being done in terms of energy prices is a consequence of war, isn't it? It is because of an illegal invasion of a sovereign state that has pushed up the price of energy. And when you look through and looked at the level of increase that people would face, it was going to put strong businesses out of business, and it was going to affect people quite high up the income scale. That is why the intervention needed to be so comprehensive. And inevitably, we went through this as to where would you stop? Which business would you cut out? And initially, you think, well, you'll protect small businesses because big businesses can take care of themselves. But what if you're a chain of care homes? Can you take care of yourself when your energy bill goes up sixfold or possibly more? Or does it fundamentally affect you? And then what do you do with the people in the care home when the care home goes bust? So the existential threat is the right way of looking at it as a consequence of war, and that is what government does. That's why we have government. It is to protect us from things that we cannot do for ourselves. And coping with the energy bill was simply too great a problem, as with shutting down business through COVID. We had to have the furlough scheme because we had told businesses to shut. Very few businesses can go without serving a single customer for 3 months, even if they're fantastically well capitalised. And that's the point at which government has to act. And so a comprehensive scheme was needed for energy prices and was something that proper Tories, if I may put it that way, should believe in, because we believe in a reasonable role for the state, a banker of last resort, a provider of last resort as a role for the state, the backstop, the fine leg, if you haven't got a very good wicket keeper, I suppose, is, if we put it in cricketing terms, that is the role of the government. And that's what we did, and we stopped the ball going to the boundary, because otherwise it would have been a defeat for the British economy.
So what was the tipping point from the campaign to govern saying that this was not the right thing to do, and the new government doing it?
It was the extremity of the price change. Bear in mind, prices have gone up significantly, even with this intervention, for households and for businesses. That we are protecting people on benefits who will receive sufficient additional support to mean that they are broadly in the same position that they were a year ago. But people who are not in receipt of benefits and people in business for their business costs will still see a strong price signal. So what the government has done is protect from that bit that was beyond that which could be coped with by a normal business or a normal household. And that seems to me to be the right thing to do. So it's a question of the extent of the problem, rather than saying we're not going to help under any circumstances, which was never implicit, I think, in what the Prime Minister said.
Tina McKenzie.
Yeah, I think the idea that it's for 6 months is quite worrying for the business community. in that, we like to have plan, we like to know what we're facing. We've got price inflation sitting at around, for us, producer price inflation sitting around 22%, as well as everything else that's going on for businesses. And I think, firstly, we were waiting on it. When we finally got it, it was definitely a relief. But Jacob is right. Some of the bills are still really, really high. And some of the standing charges are getting higher as well. And I am glad to hear you say that when you get to the end of the 6 months, you aren't looking at it on a sector basis, because I think somebody said we'll look at it, for example, just for hospitality and pubs or something, but that we've got to look at it right across the piece, because so many businesses in all sectors are struggling, and we don't know where we'll be at the end of March, so we've got to do something before then. And we will be talking to you about some of those businesses that are really struggling, because either A, they use a lot of energy. You think your local butchers coming into the spring and summer, domestic households may use less, but that local butcher will be using a lot more coming into the hot weather. And there are plenty of other examples which show certain businesses have to use a lot of energy coming into the warmer weather. Now, not a big problem, I have to say, in Belfast or Edinburgh, Glasgow or Aberdeen, but certainly more of a problem as the more south you get of the United Kingdom. So looking at it, but not on a sectoral basis, is really what we've got to do, and we've got to be prepared to act.
We are doing a review, and I hear groans coming when I talk of government reviews, but we have to work out how best to spend the money and how extensive the support should be. But the commitment is that the review will give us an answer in January, and that therefore we will be able to give people plenty of notice as to what is going to happen from the 1st of April. Because I completely understand that businesses that will be setting tariffs for the summer will want to know what their situation is. That's a completely reasonable point. Businesses always ask for certainty, but certainty is not something that is in the gift of mankind to provide. Life is fundamentally uncertain, and actually a lot of profit is made in business because of dealing with uncertainty. So I'm not going to promise things that I simply can't deliver, and certainty is one of those things, but trying to get information out early is something the government can do.
Do you feel it's a fair charge that government has made the race for certainty rather worse in the last couple of weeks?
No, I don't think it's a fair charge at all. I'm shocked that Conservative Home should make such a charge.
Merely an outlet for a variety of questions. But, I mean, I'd be interested to know what the FSB's view in terms of what's happened.
We were really, and I think everybody in the room will admit that, things in Downing Street have been pretty preoccupied and not necessarily with the right things. I think we've been really frustrated over the months of talking to different departments about and saying, businesses are closing every day, we've got to do something, this is bad now. So, we have been saying this for months, but, again, actions happened. And I'm looking forward to what's going to happen within the next few months to look at if things are worse or just as bad in 6 months' time, what are we saying to the business of the country? But, it's not just about taxes and money. There's plenty that Jacob can be getting on with that doesn't cost a penny. So one of the things I'm really hoping he's going to get on with, and something he can do pretty quickly, is to deal with late payments. Small businesses are being put out of business every day because of late payments, and that's by big businesses and sometimes even local authorities and government departments, and not on purpose. It might be inefficiencies or whatever, but the government have said for a long time they're going to deal with this, and a simple way of dealing with it would be to say that big businesses on their REMCO committees, so on the remuneration committees, they can actually have on the audit side, they can have that someone is responsible for late payments or payments to small businesses, or prompt payment is a better way of putting it, to small business in this country. So that's an easy thing just to add on to the responsibility of an audit committee of a big company to say, someone here is responsible on this board for paying small businesses on time, because it's not right that thousands are put out of business every year because they're not paid on time. And the ones that come and talk to us, some of these big businesses are their biggest customers. It's hard for them to put their hand up and say, and go public with, hey, this big business didn't pay me on time, because they may never get that type of business again. And I know you can help us with that, Jacob.
Well, that is the problem. There's no excuse for government being late in payment. And there, where we find it, we must put it right. Because the taxpayer has a responsibility to ensure that other taxpayers are treated fairly. It is really difficult in terms of business because whatever laws we pass, whatever regulations we put in, you have a small business going to its biggest customer and saying, I'm sending the bailiffs in if you don't pay, or some lower level of that. And that's really difficult because, quite understandably, small businesses are not going to say that to their biggest customer. So what I would say on this is that there are simply some things that the government cannot solve. That if you don't want to sour your relationship with your largest customer, it doesn't matter what law we pass, because you won't actually enforce it because you won't want to sour your relationship. And that is, in a way, a reality of business. So we want to put pressure on, we want to put moral pressure on, we want to lead by example, but we have set regulations up that actually businesses don't find as satisfactory. So I think there is a limit to what government can do.
You and I are going to work on this together. I'm going to show you.
But I'm going to be told what to do.
We're going to work on it together. I'm going to show you what we can do, because it's not about them taking them to court or anything else. It's about you, the government, who spends so much money with big business and who they like to be, you know, big business doesn't want to fall out with you. You can actually say to them, you'll have a name and shame, you'll have a league table, you'll do an incentive program, you'll do something to show publicly that it's something you're looking at and it's something that's not acceptable in this country.
Now, I'm aware there are a lot of questions, a lot of business people in the room, so we'll come to the audience for questions in just one moment. My final question relates, I suppose, the energy crisis is an example of this, but it's a subset of a wider problem, which is one of resilience, where I think, for example, a lot of policy people in the energy world have been warning for several years that energy policy, setting out almost as a prize making energy more expensive for businesses, has made systems and businesses more vulnerable to potential shocks. That applies in various other ways. How confident do you feel as Business Secretary that government's got it right so far in helping small businesses to be resilient to future crises? And Tina, what more would you like to see on that front?
I think we have to be honest about this and recognise that both in response to COVID and in response to energy, the government has had to provide enormous action because there wasn't resilience within the system for whatever reasons. Now, some of this is that the shock was so extreme, but even with a lesser shock, there was surprisingly little resilience within our systems, and that has been a number of factors that for reasons of efficiency, there's been a very strong move to just-in-time ordering, which then led to supply chain difficulties when factories in China closed down. And that was a structure of business encouraged, it has to be said, by government because it increased margins in the short term, and we weren't worrying about the disruption to globalization that we had. The same has been true on energy, that we thought that the ability to import LNG would be unending and would be low cost, and therefore we didn't maximize our own supplies, and we didn't crack on with nuclear energy in the way that we should have done, and we are learning these lessons belatedly. But the key thing is to remember how quickly time passes, and if we start doing things now, we will build up resilience, and it will be in a surprisingly short time in terms of political cycles. But once you're set on resilience, you have to keep with it. But it was remarkable. If I remember the figures rightly, in PPE, we went from producing under 1% of our own demand to about 80% in pretty short order. And we suddenly discovered that we could do this. But at the point of highest need, we hadn't got there. We now need to have an idea and a conversation as to what do we need that is essential for our economy, and energy is obviously pretty high up this list, that if it gets interrupted in its flows from other countries or from countries that we can't completely rely on, we have our own supplies and our own capacity. What areas are we thinking about? And you will have your ideas, but then we need to work with industry to make sure we do this. And what we mustn't do is burden industry in this country so that we then end up importing from other countries. I'm thinking of things like the steel industry, where we put unique energy burdens on our domestic steel production and this is not a clever policy.
So when we look at the UK economy and how we've moved to professional services from making things over the last number of decades, this is not just a burden, this is a huge opportunity for UK PLC to get ahead of the game, to build battery storage. We've got such great minds and entrepreneurs in this country, there's no reason why we couldn't be leading the way. So for example, with the 600,000 target on per year, I think up to 2028 on energy pumps and heat pumps, then the question is, are we hitting it? And if we are, great. If we aren't, why not? Well, we're not. We're nowhere near it. Now, the people that are going to deliver that are the small businesses around the country. So think about the people who do the gas installations. Now, here's the thing. You might not know this yet, Jacob, because you're pretty new into the job, and I wouldn't be surprised, because a lot of people don't know this, that if you go for training, if you're running a small gas installation company and you go for training, then actually you can get support from the government on that. If you go and say, I'm actually going to diversify into these heat pumps, there's no support. Isn't that a funny? I think it's just one of those things that we haven't got to looking at yet, and I know you will. And I know you're a hard worker, so you're going to get right deep into the detail on this and help the small businesses around the country to actually get their people trained up properly, let them believe that we're actually going to continue with the targets after this year and next year, so they're not going to invest and in 3 years' time we change the plan. I think there's a huge opportunity because it builds business, it's going to build productivity, it's going to build good business, profitable business, and it's going to get us where we need to go. So I think there's opportunities here if we can just get on and do it.
Thank you very much. Now, I'm very keen to bring in questions to the audience. There are a couple, this is Conservative Home, we have a couple of house rules. Firstly, I have some colleagues who have microphones, so after I ask you to ask a question, please wait for them to get to you. Secondly, when you start your question, please say who you are and where you're from. And thirdly, a question must be a question. I say this every year. If it turns into a speech, I will literally boo you until you have to sit down. And I'm pretty sure the audience will also join me. So let's start in the front row here, and then also here.
Thank you. Tony Johnson from Cheadle constituency. I'm concerned about bringing jobs back that we've lost to China and the Far East. What efforts are going to be made to do that? The reason I ask this is we've got a weak currency and have had a deficit for years, and that needs to be corrected. I feel we're helping to finance China's expansion all over the world and the West financing the war in Ukraine for the Russians.
Thank you. If you pass the microphone 2 seats along, we'll get another question at this point.
Oh, second question. Both Tina and Jacob, you've both mentioned the 85,000 VAT registration threshold as a barrier to growth for small business, also wrecks small businesses. Jacob, your cabinet colleague Anne-Marie and I wrote a VAT policy for small business a few years ago, which David Cameron liked, which was, he said, unfortunately, was against EU rules. Not a problem anymore, which introduced a very simple taper for VA registration and will allow businesses to grow through it without being destroyed. So my question is, Tina, would you be interested in looking at that? And Jacob, same question for you.
Thank you both. Tina, can we start with you, onshoring and VAT?
Do you know, I read something today about China. Maybe I shouldn't say it. But looking at the billion, and it was about the States, and looking at the billions that they've spent on wars over the last couple of decades, three to 4 decades, versus what China spent, which was practically nothing, and they put all those equivalent billions into their economy, their infrastructure, looking at the infrastructure in their country, the billions they've spent on that. And I did think about this country, and I did think, you know, we've really got to get ahead of the game. And when you talk about bringing jobs back, great. But interestingly, the amount that we spend on FDI coming into our country and paying big companies to create jobs in our constituencies, I would like to see for every pound we give a foreign company coming into our country, that we give an equivalent pound to a local business who's already employing people there.
And VAT?
Oh yes, we would definitely support looking at that, the tapered, absolutely, yeah.
Secretary of State.
Our future competitiveness is not doing many of the low-cost things that have moved to China. We are never going to compete, we shouldn't want to compete on very low labour rates producing routine objects. What we need to compete on is high-value products that require technical sophistication, and that is where we should be looking to move our economy. There is a subset of that which we touched on, which is that there are some things that are essential for our economy where we can't be dependent on regimes with which we may from time to time have disagreements. That doesn't necessarily mean we need to produce them ourselves, but we do need to be in collaboration with our friends and allies. And these may be things like rare earth metals, where the Western world is coming together to ensure that we are not entirely dependent on what one might call difficult countries. On the VAT threshold, we all, I think, deal with companies who say to us in March, would we mind awfully sending in the order in April, because they don't want to go over the £85,000 threshold. Or actually, there was a period when 3 or 4 businessmen within a week said to me that they either weren't taking somebody on, or they were trying to deter business, or whatever else they were doing, because going over the 85,000 threshold is such a barrier to growth. Where that level is set is, of course, a matter for the Chancellor, and was in fact affected by EU rules, which no longer apply. I don't think I'd better say any more than that without being wildly indiscreet.
Oh, that sounds hopeful.
No, I'm not promising you anything. I'm merely giving my own view away rather than what the Chancellor... I certainly don't want you to read anything into what the Chancellor may be planning.
I should have said that our House rules at Conservative Home do include encouraging wild indiscretion.
Look,
I'd appeal for...
I do enough of that on the Mogcast without doing it here as well.
Let's have a question here, and then the gentleman in the white shirt.
Jim Pickard, Financial Times. It feels like the elephant in the room here is the events of the last 10 days, the gyrations in financial markets. I think a lot of people in this room are worried about their mortgage rates, and for businesses here, worried about borrowing rates going up. Are you at all concerned that those rises in interest rates are going to wipe out any benefits of deregulation and tax cuts that were also in the mini-budget? Thank you.
And if we could pass the microphone on to the gentleman in the white shirt.
Thank you very much. Yeah, my name's Peter Udale. I'm a director of Responsible Finance. And I would first encourage the Minister to very much consult with Tina. I think she has some brilliant ideas, and we very much hope that she'll be part of that. I pick up on a point that Tina made about finance. And I know the government and the difficulty that small businesses are finding, and it's getting worse. It's getting much worse right now. Banks are finding it, are pulling offers, and it's very difficult. The Minister has at his disposal the British Business Bank. And over the last 8 years since the start of the British Business Bank, the total amount of lending by banks to small businesses has almost not changed at all. I feel it's a child of Treasury orthodoxy in that it doesn't really want to go out and help small businesses grow. I feel the Minister could do something about it. Would he be prepared to look at that?
Jacob.
Yes. On the British Business Bank, I'm afraid my main interaction with them so far has been on trying to get back loans made fraudulently under the bounce back scheme, where I've worked extremely closely with Lord Agnew, who is a great man, underlined, who has made such a contribution to proper protection of the taxpayers' interest. And I took over from him the responsibility in the Cabinet Office for fraud within the public sector. And the work that he had done, I was able to continue with the Public Sector Fraud Authority and trying to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes again. So this isn't quite to your question, but in setting out how we help people with energy schemes, we've involved the Public Sector Fraud Authority from day one to try and make sure we're protecting taxpayers' money. On what more can the British Business Bank do to help loans to small companies, I'm very happy to have a discussion about how that can work. Lending must be done on the basis that it is a sensible thing to do. I'm not in favour of the government picking winners. I'm not in favour of the government directing banks how to do their business. But I am in favour of capital being available and having more dynamic capital in this country, particularly at the early stages in business life, which you see much more of in the United States. And that requires some development of capital markets. With interest rates, the Federal Reserve has moved faster than the Bank of England. And I think that is one of the key things that has been going on in financial markets and currency markets, not just in the UK, but across the world. There is a marginal premium, which you would expect, on the 30-year gilt as opposed to the 30-year Treasury. That will happen whatever the UK government does. It is a pretty standard expectation of financial markets that the dollar rate is deemed to be usually a low-risk rate, and that therefore other countries will be at a premium to that. And admittedly, the Eurozone is a discount to that currently, but it is the US that fundamentally determines where interest rates are going. It has done since the dollar took over as the global currency. And that shouldn't really surprise us, and that wasn't the main result of the announcement on Friday a week ago, because the differential had already started widening and is, of course, a matter where the Bank of England is independent. And bank independence is of great importance, fully supported by the government, as you know. And the Bank of England will obviously look at what the Federal Reserve is doing.
And to Jim Pickard's point, are you concerned that all of the ideas we've just talked about on tax, regulation, competitiveness, don't end up going into creating an enterprise nation, but effectively mitigate part of the downside costs that people are suffering?
We have an inflation problem. If you have an inflation problem, monetary policy tightens. That's not controversial, everybody knows that. What can the government do that eases the monetary issue? And that is supply-side reforms, and it's an element of fiscal change as well. And that's part of, it's very much what happened in the 1980s in the United States and in the UK, that you had a strong tightening of monetary policy to deal with inflation, but you had a change in fiscal policy and on the supply side reforms that made it easier for business to do business without inflating costs. And I think we can learn from that. And the exception is, of course, the 1981 budget. And in the 1981 budget, fiscal policy is tightened. Why? To allow monetary policy to be eased, because it was deemed that monetary policy had become too tight and was having a very damaging effect on business. So there is this balance between fiscal and monetary policy, which I think the government is getting right, and it's actually what most countries in the world are doing, that most countries, including the US, are seeing a fiscal easing with a monetary tightening. That's not particularly controversial.
Tina, your response to the questions to the Financial Times and the gentleman who thinks you're right about everything.
Oh, could you tell my husband, please? You know, it's really interesting because what we see, you know, think about business, think about those shops up and down the bars that are delighted all the Conservatives are here, going to go in and spend all their money, right? You just think about them. They're not sitting on their phones looking at what's going on with British currency today. And some people don't even make the relationship between the currency and the interest rate and what's going on between fiscal policy and monetary policy. And I think it's pretty clear that if you have a loose monetary policy, then coming up with a loose fiscal policy, that's going to mean bad news. And I think the Prime Minister said it right today, this morning actually, and she said that we potentially should have looked more at the communication of this and also potentially looking at working with in line with the OBR, etc. So, you know, the Prime Minister's already said there's maybe a better way to do the communication of these things in the future. But at the end of the day, I think the fact of the matter is this: irrespective of currency markets and what's going on geopolitically, everything else, I think at the end of the day, if you've got confidence in your economy, confidence in the market, confidence with each of you prepared to go and spend some money and not worried about potentially everything's going to go really terribly, which is what we're kind of reading at the moment. If we're more confident and we continue to spend and businesses continue to invest, that can only be good for our economy. And everything else in the long run should work itself out. But in the short term, increasing interest rates is not good for business. It's not good for confidence. And increasing mortgage rates is not good for small business owners for a start, but also for their customers because they stop shopping as much. So for us, it's about getting confidence back into the storylines in the media, in the FT, about encouraging people to get out and shop local again like we did in COVID. And you know, maybe supporting people that everything isn't going to go down the tubes. You know, some of these currency, as we saw a rebound, I think, yesterday or the day before. I don't even know. I think it was yesterday we saw.
I've forgotten what day it is.
No, it wasn't. It was
Right.
Friday we saw the rebound, yeah. Going from one Labour conference to a Conservative conference certainly knocks out your time zones. Yeah, so, you know, we've seen a rebound, but ultimately for us, for our members, high interest rates, high mortgage rates, not good. We're carrying more debt than we've ever carried as a small business community coming out of COVID. People will shop less, but ultimately what our message to everyone is, get out and support your local businesses, you know, get out and spend with them because we want to keep them open. It's going to cost us, if these businesses close, as a country, it's going to cost us way more to try and get that birth rate up again in a couple of years' time. And so we want to make sure we're going out with positive messages to support them and keep people shopping.
Thank you. Now I see the question from the lady here, and then some questions from this side of the room as well, and the gentleman right over there. Oops.
Thanks very much indeed. Rosa Wilkinson from the High Value Manufacturing Catapult. I note your comment, Secretary of State, about that high value vision for the future UK economy. It's one that I very much sign up to. How do we make sure that we help those smaller businesses, which, as we heard from Tina, have smaller margins, to move up the value chain so that they are helping to grow our economy overall?
And if we can rush the microphone, I'm trying to get the step count up for our room assistants, right over to that side.
Hi there, thanks. Colin McKinley from the Russell Group of Universities. So we know how integral public R&D investment is in driving forward economic growth. In the last year alone, our universities created 33,000 jobs from spin-outs, which leveraged £5 billion in investment. But despite this return, we're seeing reports that the R&D budget is seen as low-hanging fruit from the Treasury. So my question is to you, Jacob, how much of a priority is the R&D budget to you in your new position? Will you commit to previous government spending commitments? And Tina, what would you like the government to do on R&D?
Let's go to Tina first.
Okay, maybe to Rosie's point first, yeah. You know, when you're running a small business, not everybody wants to be a medium-sized business for a start, but when you do want to scale, actually understanding how you scale, getting access to finance and access to other kind of areas of expertise, really, really important. So I think it's about getting businesses that have scaled to talk to the businesses that are smaller and get that network going more. And again, that's something I think Jacob's department could work on because it's free, and medium-sized businesses would be happy to help small businesses to do that. I think some of the help to grow digital vouchers, not a lot of people know about them. It's just we kind of lobbied government to say, let's make these help to go digital vouchers for all small businesses, not just those with 5 FTE and more. So they've just changed that, and that's £5,000 towards a digital investment, which helps small businesses go digital, e-commerce, get on the internet, and we've seen a lot of that accelerated through COVID, so that was good news as well. I think also having some help to green schemes, some help to green vouchers for smaller businesses as well will help with their energy costs, help them invest more to go medium-sized. In terms of R&D, I think R&D and the vouchers that are available for the credits available for R&D as well, really, really important. And that's something that's brilliant about this country, actually. You know, if you look at the KTPs with the universities and the links with small businesses and them spinning out and then, you know, some of them going onto the market, floating, doing really well. I mean, it's a perfect success story of small starting universities with R&D and then spin out. It's one of the things we do really, really well. So I'd like to see us protect that and expand it.
Yes, thank you. How do you get businesses to move up the value chain? Well, I think one of the important things in the announcement 10 days ago was the capital allowance going up to £1 million, which means almost all small businesses are able to offset all their investment every year. And that's really helpful because actually when I visit businesses, what is really striking is the advantages of capital investment in terms of increasing productivity, in terms of reducing costs, of making labour more efficient, that's the way the economy has to go. And we've lagged in that. We know we've lagged in that in the last 30 years, where we haven't seen the productivity improvements that we would like to see. So I think that's how you move up the value chain. It is more automation, and it's more investment in equipment. But it also ties very neatly in with R&D and ensuring that the R&D is effectively used to be productive. I also think this is about bringing more capital into the country to make sure that our R&D goes from stage 1 to stage 2, 3, 4 and 5. I'm very excited about ARIA. I think ARIA is a really good organisation. It's freed from government controls, and therefore there is a chance that it won't give money to people who are best at filling out the forms, but will give money to people who have the best business ideas, and will generate a real venture capital opportunity in this country, combined with changing rules like Solvency II that will make it easier for some investors to take what is perceived as a higher risk, in my view wrongly, because actually if you have an intelligent spread of venture capital investments, the risk of it is not much greater than investing in public equity markets. That may then attract money in globally, and suddenly we become an interesting competitor for the west coast of the United States. That must be our aim, but it's only a start. And that ties in with the government's money available for R&D, but it's actually not the government's money, which is essentially seed capital. It's how do you turn that into a dynamic industrial activity. And if ARIA works, then we should put up a statue to Dominic Cummings.
One of, no doubt, many reasons why one might...
No, I think it's the only reason we want to put up a statue to Dominic Cummings.
It sounds like...
I'd be delighted.
Sounds like some might be pondering more of a Coulson fate, for so to say. This relates to a question we've had from an online viewer, actually, one of those watching on YouTube, which is, can the Secretary of State comment on his view on the future of Innovate UK?
In what specific...
I believe it's
way?
currently open as to, with regard to determining its future, whether you have a preference in terms of...
You know I can't prejudge things that haven't been decided, even, I'm sorry to say, on a Conservative Home webcast.
No problem, thank you. Now,
Maybe I could help on that. Because it was from Northern Ireland, they probably also want to know something else in terms of what can Jacob do around supporting a solution to the Northern Ireland Protocol Bill, which is causing a lot of issues, as you know, Jacob, but we've got to get on and get a deal, and we've got to get on and get our trade. You know, you talk about productivity. 10 years ago, the UK was sitting, and you'll know this, 4 or 5. If you look at all of the tracks in terms of what we were exporting in the world, we were number 4, number 5, number 4. We're now number 10, 11, 12, 10, 11, 12. We've got to get on and get this deal done. And I'd like to think you're there putting your shoulder to the wheel to help us get through the issues with the protocol and get an EU trade deal done so we can increase the amount we export in this country.
We've got 10 minutes, so if you could fix the protocol at this point.
There are answers available.
Look, I think the bill before Parliament provides an answer, and we need to be able to trade as a single United Kingdom. That's my fundamental priority.
Is that something you agree with?
Yeah,
Yeah, but we need to get on and get the trade deal done.
Well, we've got the TCA with the EU. The EU is not enormously keen on the United Kingdom and is not making the TCA work fluidly, and we have issues with Horizon and things like that, which they said they'd do and they haven't done. I can't control the European Union. I don't want to control the European Union either. I'm jolly glad we're out of it. But I think His Majesty's government can control trade within the United Kingdom, and it is a single United Kingdom, and we cannot allow the European Union to stop us trading with Northern Ireland from GB. It's monstrous, and the legislation is before Parliament to deal with that. It's about to arrive in their Lordships' house, and I hope their Lordships will give it fair passage.
Thank you. Now, as I mentioned, because we're having fun, time is flying by. So we have about 10 minutes left. So let's take a batch of 3 questions. Entirely nepotistically, first I'm going to go to my own sister, who's over there. Then the question here in the pink shirt. And then I'm going to try and be balanced. The gentleman at the back who's been very patient.
Thank you. Jane Wallace from Trustpilot. Wanted to ask the Secretary of State, in the coming 12 months, what will be your priorities for your new department? And within that, the draft Digital Markets Consumer and Competition Bill that was announced in the Queen's speech, the government's evidently looking at reprioritising its agenda moving forward. So it'd be great to get your take on that. Thank you.
And a question here, the pink shirt.
Thank you. My name is Paul Benstead, Altrincham and Sale West. The first thing really is just to say thank you very much for scrapping the IR35 reforms. That's a big win. It hasn't received much media attention at all, although LinkedIn went crazy, so thank you very much for that. Secondly, a little bit easier, hopefully. Of course, Jacob was referring to small businesses being tax collectors. Of course, in the next couple of years, there's going to be a move to making tax digital, which, from my company's perspective, is a bit of a nightmare because I'm moving from one tax return per year to possibly 4 or 5, which seems a needless burden for me because HMRC has been quite happy having a single tax return for, since the year dot, frankly. Any chance you can sort of push it back or sort of, do something? Has there been a lot of focus on that?
Thank you. And the third question here.
Tim Troman, Northumberland Conservatives, but I'm also a small business of 5-year standing, limited company, single director. So I was obviously very pleased with the government rolling back the dividend tax, which many of us don't pay our self-sufficient salary. So that's very much welcome. I was slightly concerned to hear that the definition of a small business has been pushed up the chain, being at the very bottom, single working director. Just wondered what sort of policies we could possibly have come forward for people in that area, because I suspect a lot of the growth is going to come from the bottom, not from the top.
Tina.
Yeah, I mean, we've been talking about IR35 for self-employed people for a long time. So, we've been lobbying to get it changed to work in a more reasonable way. I think for most people, it was just so confusing what you could and what you couldn't do. So we were pleased that the government listened on that. Now, more detail to come, so keep an eye on it. Quarterly tax returns, for sure. That's not something we want to be, Jacob said he doesn't want to bring in more paperwork, make it more burdensome, more regulation where we don't need it. And that's, that's great. So I'm sure he will support you in that we only need one tax return. And I know the Treasury to be fair, are looking at how we make it easier for small businesses. We've been working with them on that in terms of, going digital with your tax return and how we can make it as easy as possible. So I think keep an eye on that space. I'm hoping it won't be quarterly, that's for sure.
Secretary of State.
Thank you. Well, I'd better answer your sister's brilliant question first. The priority really is energy. And at the moment, that is absolutely everything to make sure that we get the energy policy right, that we get money to people in the right way, that we come up with the right conclusion of the review for what happens for the further periods. So that has inevitably taken a lot of the thought processes away from other things. But I think the next thing is the growth economy. How do we do things that make the economy grow? And that looks to retained EU law, the deregulatory space, making it a more favourable set of conditions for businesses. And so the Digital Markets Bill is under review as to exactly how that will fit in with all of this with a new government. On IR35, Gloria in excelsis Deo. I had privately and not so privately argued against it for quite a long time. And one of the glories of our system is that we are all constituency MPs. And the number of my constituents who came to see me explaining why IR35 was simply putting them out of business. It made it impossible for them to do something, and it's the view that sometimes seems to come from HMRC that every entrepreneur is basically trying to fiddle the tax system, which is not true. And most entrepreneurs are trying to obey the tax system properly. And I've always thought that the fundamental error of IR35 is it's where a business begins. That you have nice, safe employment, you're covered by all the protections, so on and so forth. You think, I'll do this for myself. Who's your first customer likely to be? The company you used to work for. From that, you then get a second customer, third customer, 20th customer, and you employ people, and it grows. And the tax advantages when you're very small are minimal because you have all the reporting requirements, you have to pay an accountant, all of this, which eats into the supposedly extra profit that you're making that HMRC was trying to nab for the Treasury. So I thought it was absolutely classic HMRC looking at everything through the angle of tax and not through economic growth. So I'm delighted that it's happened. And I'm not going to say anything on making tax digital, though you may read between the lines, my view, or you may not, because I better not tread on other people's toes unduly. On micro businesses, I mean, I think this does tie in. I think the move away from IR35 is a big boon for micro businesses, many of whom start off in that space. And I mean, I think the reversal of responsibility back to the individual is absolutely right. It's completely unreasonable, and always was, to expect businesses to determine how their supplier was operating. I mean, just in sort of ordinary common sense, how was the business supposed to know? What was it supposed to do to check? How much uncertainty did that create? What potential liability was it creating? So I think reversing it is, as I was saying in answer to the previous question, the first step in helping micro businesses.
Thank you very much. Now, there are three events I briefly need to draw your attention to, ladies and gentlemen. Next up, in this very marquee at 7:45, I will be hosting the humanitarian reception with the British Red Cross, Liam Fox, Robert Jenrick and others. A couple of topics that have come up in this discussion. Tomorrow in here at 4:15, we have a discussion on new nuclear energy and energy security, which has come up, and a discussion at 3 o'clock on Tuesday on the importance of universities in driving regional growth. But it falls to me to say what a pleasure it's been yet again to host the business conversation. Thank you so much to all of you here and at home for your questions, for taking part and observing this discussion. Thank you to the FSB for partnering with Conservative Home again to make this event possible. And of course, thank you to the Secretary of State, Jacob Rees-Mogg, and Tina McKenzie for your fantastic questions and answers.
Thank you very much.